Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Our guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Daniel Patrick, who you've met before on this podcast when we chatted about Mike Marshall and Chris Thiele's Into the Cauldron, and I also caught up with when I talked about IBMA last year. And he's also the host of the Mandolins and Beer podcast, which we all know and love. But he's here tonight to talk about his own music, which is really cool. He has a new album out called Around the Clock, and we're going to chat about that. Daniel, welcome back.
Hey, Matt. How are you, buddy?
Yeah, good. Always nice to talk to you.
Great to talk to you too. Boy, I love the accent. I literally feel like I am on like the BBC or some NPR. And actually, I really am. Congrats. I mean, you were nominated for the IBMA award for Broadcaster of the Year, and the first podcaster ever, which is amazing. I'm so happy for you. I was pulling for you to get the win, but to be nominated is just as great. So yeah, thanks for having me on, Matt.
Oh, thank you. It's so cool just to even be in that conversation somewhere. Do you know what I mean? I think what people like you are doing, and there's so many cool podcasts around this sort of string band space at the moment. And I think people appreciate that. There's a lot of great content coming out.
Agreed.
And so maybe we'll talk about the podcast a little bit later on, but I'm really keen to talk about this record, which is not only like a bunch of music from you, but also like a bit of a who's who in the mandolin world right now as well. It features 11 tracks, each is a duet with you and a different mandolin player, all of whom will be familiar to people who listen to both our podcasts. How did this idea come about?
I've been super lucky similar probably to what you might have experienced the couple times you've been able to come over to IBMA, but I've been able to kind of get to know some of the players over the course of all these years. And then I've been able to go to festivals and hang out, at festivals or hang out in hotel rooms at IBMA. And you get to see some really cool, intimate moments that a lot of people don't really get to see. And it's really inspiring. And it's just two people with instruments just playing. It doesn't even necessarily have to be a fiddle tune, for instance. But, when you walk up and Peter Rohn and Michael Daves are sitting on a picnic table playing a song that they know together, to see that as someone who's such a fan of this music, I was like, wow, that is so cool. And that was the initial seed for the idea. Is I'd love to just record a record of playing songs in a very intimate situation, as if I was sitting on my couch and Tim O'Brien was over, and he's just like, oh, do you know the song? And then you play a song. And that was the whole idea that started it. And then it kind of became, a lot of times on my podcast, one of the questions I ask is, do you have other influences? I mean, obviously you must have other influences besides Bill Monroe, as a mandolin player, using that as the stock. I mean, it's pretty rare to interview somebody who is not a Bill Monroe fan, But, Sam Bush and Ronnie McCoury. Sam Bush is a huge Allman Brothers fan. Ronnie McCoury is a huge Grateful Dead fan. So they have their own styles. And I thought it would be cool to pick songs that I thought of when I thought of the artist from, most of the time after I interviewed them, knowing what their influences were. So selecting the songs, for the most part, that was how that process happened, how I picked them.
And how did you go about picking the list of players? Was the one person you called first?
This is going to sound crazy. So I have to give credit, though, first. The first person, so I mentioned this idea to Joe K. Walsh. Joe Walsh actually was doing the Alan Bybee camp. And Alan Bybee lives in Myrtle Beach, which is just about an hour and a half north of Charleston. And Joe Walsh is a foodie. And Charleston has got all these great restaurants. And he mentioned he's always wanted to eat at this restaurant, Husk. And I'm like, well, you're coming to Myrtle Beach, right? And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, flying to Charleston, and I'll drive you to Myrtle Beach the next day. You can stay at my place, and I'll make reservations for us at Husk, and we can go to Husk. And he's like, awesome. So, met dinner with Joe Walsh, and we're eating, and I just happened to say, like, I've kind of got this idea to do this, like, mandolin duet album, but with vocals. And, and he's just like, well, I'm getting a mandocello, mandolin and mandocello sound cool together. And I'm like, wow, it sounds like Joe Walsh would do this. So that was months before I decided to pull the trigger. So then the first person I emailed was Tim O'Brien, and Tim O'Brien's manager, actually, just to make it official. And he said yes. And I figured, well, I mean, if Tim O'Brien says yes, it might be easier to get a few more yeses and people will take it seriously. And fortunately, pretty much everybody, aside from, a couple scheduling things that didn't get to work out, everybody said yes. So that was pretty wild to have happen. And and so I just kind of thought of, there's so many players. Like I could have done this with any of 100 players, so I really had to kind of think of like strong ties to these songs that like I thought would sound really cool. And that's kind of how I like bobbed and weaved to pick who the people I would want to do on there.
And were these all songs that kind of you knew and meant something to you, or did you learn them kind of for this project based on the people who you thought might want to play these songs?
Every one of these songs means a lot to me. It's funny because the first song, so I've been covering the song Drive by the Cars for years. Actually, I covered it after, even though Rick Ocasek didn't sing it, after Rick Ocasek passed away, people were like doing all these Cars kind of tributes. And I just always thought Drive was just like a great song. And one of my all-time favorite duet albums, and maybe even all-time favorite albums, is Real Time with Tim O'Brien and Daryl Scott.
Mm.
So every time I would play this song with my duet partner, who I love playing with, but like I was just like, I would love to record this with Tim O'Brien someday. And the funny thing is like Tim O'Brien was barely familiar with the Cars. Like he had heard the name, but that wasn't one of the bands that really ever resonated, in his world. So that's one of the ones that really wasn't specific to that artist, as much as say the Sam Bush song or the Jerry Garcia song with Ronnie, which is kind of funny, like now telling the stories about the songs. And Hey Joe Walsh's tune Angel by Hendrix. I think of Hendrix because I texted with Joe Walsh actually 2 seconds ago. He just texted me, and we texted, probably once a month about just whatever. And I always try not to start my text, Hey Joe, because it just seems so, cheesy. But so I think of Jimi Hendrix every time I think of Joe Walsh, and Angel by Hendrix is just one of my favorite songs. Like I think Jimi Hendrix, even though he's known as this great blues guitar player, he has some great tunes. I mean, Little Wing, Wind Cries Mary, like he's a really good songwriter on top of that. So that, those are some of the things. But yeah, the Tim O'Brien one was kind of the outlier.
Yeah, it's funny because I don't know like what it's like in the States, but that song is so kind of tied in for me with watching Live Aid as a kid. Because I don't know if it was the same in the States, but they showed kind of a video as part of the day itself, like on the BBC coverage, that was just a montage of footage from Ethiopia set to that track.
Oh, wow.
And it was like, it's such an emotional punch to it. So I think that song is just known by people who've never heard of the Cars in this country. But I don't know what they put out in the footage everywhere else.
I want to send my version to Uber. I think who's going to drive you home tonight. I mean, come on, it's like a match made in heaven.
And so you sort of saying about wanting it to feel like just sort of picking on your couch with somebody playing through some songs. How much preparation did kind of you do with them for that? Had you played through the songs with them? Had you sort of... We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collings Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collings Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collingsguitars.com. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com.
It all happened the first time I saw any of these people in person, aside from Jarrod Walker, but that we didn't. He was just in town with Billy Strings. So we didn't play at all. But there was zero prep together. On my end, it was manic. Mm-hmm. I mean, because what I also really wanted it to be was live. You know, obviously with isolation to get the best sounds. But I didn't want it to be like, okay, I'll play my mandolin part, you play your mandolin part. I'll sing my part, you sing your part. I didn't want that. I didn't want to do the tracks at my house. I mean, everybody's got some sort of home studio now, and I didn't want to do that. And one of the things that really kind of made it special to me, this project, was I traveled to wherever they lived. So I went to Nashville and did a session, went to Brooklyn, drove up to Portland, Maine from Brooklyn, went to Asheville, went back to Nashville 2 more times, because I really wanted it to be as live as possible. And pretty much everything, unless there was a glaring mistake instrumentally, all of that was tracked live. So unless there was a glaring error that was like, that take was great, except for this, we would just record again, and then they would be able to grab it if we had a better take, or, and comp it together a little bit, and then some of the vocal parts. And again, that I think kind of comes down to, like Sam and Ronnie, for example, they wanted to sing their parts after playing, which is fine with me. You know what I mean? That's because that's just how they are so used to doing it. So, they did that, but that'd be the only thing really that was punched in. And even that, those are pretty close to one takes, because those guys are just so great at what they do.
And do you find with those, like, is recording a mandolin while you're singing, how hard is it to get a decent sound on the voice and the mandolin while you're doing that?
So to give you an example of the ones that were 100% live, I decided when I was trying to figure out how to do the tracks on the album, I decided I would just break them up by which studio I recorded them at. So the first 3 songs were at Dark Shadow. The next 4 songs, so Drive, Hey Bulldog, To Find a Friend, and I Got a Name. Those are all live takes. Every one of them. And it's not as hard as you think once you get the mix right. Those first 4 songs were done with Mark Howard, who was awesome, and he was great with and he would even be like, I think you maybe need a little bit more of your vocal in your headphones, sort of thing, like giving you tips, as he could tell, like if I was maybe being a little laid back and stuff like that. So it wasn't as hard as you would think it is. But I also do it a lot at home. I'd sung those songs by myself a bunch of times. So,
and is it easy getting a sound where the mandolin's not getting in the way of the vocal sound, and the vocal itself isn't bleeding too much into the mandolin mic?
Yeah, well, that would be every place that I worked with. Everybody who did like the engineering and the mic placement, they did such an incredible job. It was like nearly perfect from the minute I sat down. Like, and everybody, the crazy thing about this to me is how much everybody from the studios to the artists were invested in this as much as I was. Like to see Tim O'Brien come in and spend so much time even before the first take, making sure what he was doing was cool with me, which is just so crazy to think, because like he probably could have done anything and I would have been like, sounds great, man. But everybody, like, to getting in and moving mics while you're playing before you record, or you take a second to do another take and they come back in and adjust little things. Like that happened at every place. They cared so much. It was awesome, to see that everybody really wanted the whole thing to make me happy, which is, I don't know. I maybe that's probably how every studio situation is, but I've been in studio situations before where it was definitely not the case, in my younger days. So yeah, that helped, having people who knew exactly. They'd all done acoustic music or acoustic recording at some point. I think, I'm not positive, I know like Mark Howard recorded, he was a guitar player on those Sturgill Simpson Cut and Grass albums. Mm. But I don't know if they did them there or if they did them at a place called the Butcher Shop in Nashville. But now the Butcher Shop is combined with the Tractor Shed because the Butcher Shop, the guy had sold the building on them. But, like so many things, or so many people who had been there had recorded. The one in Portland, Maine, oddly enough, was a brand new studio. It was the first session ever to record in the studio that he built.
Oh, wow.
Incredible job building. And Noah Fishman was there, who's been on the podcast a couple times and knows Joe via Berkeley, and or maybe not Berkeley, the other one. Well, he knows Joe. He's an incredible player, and he did the engineering, and it was perfect.
It's so cool. I love records that are like a duo or a trio, where you can hear kind of the interplay and you can hear everything that goes on. Stuff doesn't get lost in the mix, and it's just really cool hearing. It's not always two mandolins. Obviously, there's a bit more of a mix in terms of some mandola and some octave mandolin, but it's not a sound you hear that often. So it's really cool to kind of hear the interplay and hear what everybody's doing.
Oh, thank you. And the other thing I really want to, and I like to say this on episodes, because I saw Casey Campbell too, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do vocals is because Casey Campbell did that duets album with just mandolins a few years ago. And to me, that is the perfect recording. There's just no way I could have come anywhere near. Like, I'm like, I have to use the vocal part, because I also can sing, and so I was just like, yeah, it's got to be vocals, because doing it would just, in my opinion, probably pale in comparison to what Casey did. That record is incredible.
Well, it's a bit like a guitar player sort of doing a bunch of tunes in that way, when Bryan Sutton's already done Not Too Far From the Tree. It's that kind of, some records just set such a benchmark, don't they? That
exactly.
Whether anybody else is thinking that or not, you're kind of in your own head. That's the blueprint for something like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And it's a really interesting mix of stuff, like the B songs here that pretty much anybody would know. There's some, it's not necessarily loads and loads of obscure stuff, but it's such an interesting mix of stuff. And just like running through the artists, from the Beatles, Tom Petty, Jim Croce, who I love, you don't hear his music anywhere near enough these days. But it's also really interesting reading the notes. And I'm a total geek, so I love reading which instruments were played on which tracks. It's like,
me too.
It's one of those where I get cross if people don't tell you that kind of thing on their liner notes. But it's particularly with a project like this.
Yeah, and especially, like, I would imagine, like you do too, is when you have somebody on, you try to research as much as possible, and like the liner notes are just a non-existent thing anymore, So I really wanted to put all that information in there, and I wanted people to know that, and so I just figured I have a really great graphic artist that did the work on it, and he did a really good job with putting it all on the back cover too. Because I'm like, I don't know if anybody will necessarily buy it, although they are buying it physically. Thank goodness. The vinyl's selling really, really well, and the CDs are actually moving. But yeah, I love that stuff, and so I was like, I have to put that stuff in there.
And people who are buying something like this are going to want to know. Do you know what I mean? That's the kind of stuff that they're fascinated by.
Yeah, I think so too.
So it's funny. I've started buying CDs again fairly recently, and buying old stuff just for the liner notes, really. because I want to know who engineered it. And I want to, you can find some stuff online, but it's often quite garbled and not necessarily true. And you often get like a little essay that comes with it that just, I love all that context.
I do too. It's funny. I still do buy UCDs. That's my favorite thing to do when I go to Nashville. And actually, on the way to IBMA, I stopped in Raleigh. There are these. I'm going to spoil my secret now, my secret spots. But there are these chains called McKay's, and they're used bookstores, but they also have crazy used music selections. And with like a lot of this music, you can only find it maybe on YouTube. Like, it's not on any of the streaming services. If you find it on YouTube, it might be like Take's Bluegrass channel, but that's vinyl being dumped to YouTube. And so I'm always scouring the UCD Bluegrass sections at those stores because I just love having the notes. Like you said, I love reading about it. And, I love when I'm putting it in the computer to rip it, onto my computer so I can listen to it anywhere, looking through the booklet and who played on what. And yeah. And again, there's certain things that you don't realize. Now I've been doing that with vinyl as well. And it's interesting. There's not as much, a lot of the older bluegrass stuff is just ripped to shreds, like vinyl wise. But I picked up like a David Greer album that Sam Bush played a couple songs on, still sealed, from McKay's in the used section.
Right.
So that's I love doing that. Going to any town now, I look for, usually the used music stores or record stores, and occasionally music stores if they have mandolins. A lot of times, a mandolin is not something you're going to roll into the average music store and find usually a nice one. It's usually beginner ones, which is nothing wrong with that if you're first getting into it, but if I can find like a place like Music Emporium outside of Boston that's got, Northfields, Gilchrist's, Dude and Bostels, it's like a candy store.
We have this, it's really hard to find stuff like that over here in the UK. And all the mandolins I bought from a place in Brighton called the Acoustic Music Company, run by a guy called Trevor. And you'd go there and there would be a Collings and there'd be a Northfield and there'd be, some old Rigels, and like you might see a flat iron and stuff that you're just not going to see anywhere else here unless it's in the hands of somebody playing it. And those right. Stores are amazing. And that one's gone now, but they're amazing places.
Is it really? Man, it stinks. It's so tough, the technology thing is really, it's like a weird dichotomy, I think, for guys like us, because without technology, we wouldn't be doing these podcasts that both of us find so fulfilling, but at the same time, as I'm finding with putting an album out, I'm really a lot more, I feel, for the artists who really rely on the music only to do stuff, because it really is, it's expensive to get vinyl made for sure. It's not a huge profit thing, and that's the thing, and you got to carry it if you go to gigs, but like music stores are disappearing, and a lot of people just stream, and that's fine. I just want people to hear these songs, but I also am fortunate to have a podcast with sponsors, and I play a lot of gigs, so that helps. And a lot of gigs are local, so I don't have to travel a bunch. But for artists out there, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I can't think of their name right now. I feel terrible. Mountain Grass Unit, for instance. Incredible band, young guys. And I don't even know if they're printing their stuff physically for this newest release. It might just be a digital thing. And, I don't know. I just feel bad because I grew up in the era where I loved going to music stores to buy records and then CD cassettes and CDs, and that, there was something special about that, to see these shops, just closing. And, you find some vinyl stores that are cool, but, it's then just for them to make a living, they have to sell the vinyl for like $45 for, and it's just like, gosh darn it, $45 for a record, and yeah, I don't know. It's tough.
Yeah. I used to work in music shops when I was, in my teens and early 20s. That's sort of what I did. Just worked in record stores, and that was the at the point people were transitioning over from vinyl and cassettes to CDs and buying all their stuff
Yeah,
again, and like just thought at that point that CD people would get rid of all their CDs and they'd be fairly obsolete was just nuts. That it was part of my weekend routine was going around all the record shops, like the new ones, the used ones, trawling through stuff. You'd buy a load of stuff and then go and sit somewhere and have a drink with your mates and go through what you'd bought and look at it all and read the liner notes and make all those connections and go, oh, the guy who played bass on this also played bass on that. That's amazing. And it's all that stuff
yeah,
that's just, you have to look for it so hard now. That's part of the joy
yeah,
of having these kinds of conversations is just making some of those connections and pulling some of that back out of the air a little bit.
totally. And what is interesting is CDs are making a comeback. I was in Athens, Georgia, at a really cool music store, and the guy who runs it was great because he was real kind of ornery, and I won't use the language he used, but he was playing like a really blues rock '70s sort of album, and it's like just really really good. And he's wandering around like, what is this playing? He's like, it's UFO back when they were blanking good, you know, just real crotchety. And he had some CDs too. I'm like, you selling CDs starting to sell? He's like, that's all the college kids in town are buying right now is CDs over vinyl in Athens, he said. I'm like, wow, that's wild. So yeah, somebody might be sitting on a gold mine if they hung onto those CDs.
Well, it's the interesting thing with a lot of this stuff, isn't it? It's they must all still be out there somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, I would think so. I mean, it's interesting. Like, do you guys have things like Goodwill? Are you familiar with what Goodwill
Yeah,
is?
we have a similar thing.
Yeah, so they a lot of times like there's always like hundreds of CDs at the Goodwills by our house, and like comparative to vinyl, like when you go to look for vinyl at the Goodwill, it's usually pretty, it's like Lawrence Welk and stuff like that. But yeah, there are just hundreds of CDs, and so I'll go there every now and again and just look for something. I found, actually, speaking of Mark Howard, I found an album with him playing mandolin on the whole thing. The guy who engineered 4 of the tracks on my album that I didn't know existed. It was like a Cracker Barrel release or something like that, and it's incredible. And I bought it at Goodwill for $1.
Is that the same Mark Howard who did those couple of records? There's one called Smoky Mountain Bluegrass Tradition and one
Yeah,
called Smoky Mountain Old Time Tradition. And they're such good albums, those.
they're great albums. Sam Bush plays all over one of those, and then he also did a couple albums with him and John Hartford. So yeah, I didn't realize how good of a mandolin player he was though until I got that mandolin album. And I was like, oh, geez, I'm glad I bought this after I played, after I recorded.
Well, it's cool that you're kind of selling this physically and that people are buying it. I think that's great. What the fascinating thing is, because you do a lot of shows, like this isn't the kind of thing you're going to get to play with people. But I was chatting to you at IBMA and you had a really cool idea about how you might do some of this live.
Yeah, so that's the next step here is I've got the tracks without me. So it's just Sharon Gilchrist and her mandolin, and I'm gonna go out and try and play some shows and play the album and kind of maybe talk about the experiences behind that, and then some other tracks as well that I've been recording, the backing tracks of acoustic guitar and upright bass. So yeah, so that's the idea. It's just going out there and doing it. It's so hard. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, and it's spent so many years playing here that I've gotten comfortable, with some regular gigs, but also with like corporate and private events. So I'll get a couple offers a week for those types of gigs, and it's it's hard to find an area where I can get away for more than a few days to be able to go out and do that. But that is definitely the thing I'd love to do. Like, I would love to go to a brewery, because Mandolins and Beer, I'd love to play at a brewery. I'd love to play that album and some other songs, and then have just like a mandolin hangout. Like, just have, bring your mandolins out and, let's jam. And I did something similar to that in Austin with Kim Warner and Billy Bright, where we did like a mandolin clinic. And it was just so cool to see. It was kind of right in the middle of COVID. So, they would only let us sell, I think it was 20 or 25 people could come to this, and but it sold out pretty quick, and it was just all these people who played mandolin that had never met each other, and they all live in the same area. And that was cool when we were leaving, because we had to go do a TV thing, that they were just hanging out jamming. it was awesome. I'm like, this is what music is about, like that oral tradition, this style of music anyway. It's about playing a song that and then having somebody show you a song you've never played, and now you go and learn it or look up, Snowflake Reel and find the 50 versions that'll blow your mind and combine those. And yeah, so that's definitely what I want to do. So.
Yeah, I love that idea. Sort of, you could, doing a bit of a roadshow of going around breweries, doing like a workshop followed by a gig and a hangout. And, because people love, resources like Mandolin Cafe and stuff are amazing. But getting people in a room is also a really powerful thing, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I do need to, speaking of Mandolin Cafe, I've got to give a huge shout out to Scott and what a huge support he's been for not only the podcast, but even like just for me, like sorting out how something got really popular, more popular than I thought it was going to get, and like dealing with everything from advertisers to, responding. Do you respond to emails who are like, less than polite, you just, fortunately it's few and far between for those, but every now and again, somebody's got a better way to do something and they don't necessarily, I'm all for constructive criticism. It's made the podcast better, in my opinion, by having people give me tips or like, hey, you should read this book on interviewing by this ESPN host. Cause I didn't go to journalism school. I just started playing music full time, and I had 8 hours a day to do. I had nothing to do but like play mandolin and wait to go play a gig. And I did not know what to do with that time. And I wanted to become a better player. And so I was like, how did Joe Walsh become a better player? How did David Benedict, like when they had time, what did they use? And then I thought, well, if I'm going to ask those guys that, maybe I should record it. Then I'm like, there's no mandolin podcasts. And so I'm like, well, let's give it a shot, and here we are 5 years later, talking about an album that I put out. And again, like, if it wasn't for this podcast, I definitely wouldn't have put an album out with these incredible players, for sure. I probably wouldn't be talking to you. It's been a life changer and a game changer. And I couldn't be more thankful to the people who listen and to the people like yourself who help out and help promote it and do what you do. And, it's very humbling to, have the support of so many people. And like Scott putting the songs on the front page when they came out as singles. And again, like that's just what Scott does. That's not even like special treatment. If you have a song that's got mandolin, reach out to Scott. Scott will put it on his website. Scott's awesome, what he's built up over there. So yeah, thank you to Scott.
Well, and it is incredible and such a resource and such a kind of, I think it's a thing that, so you're talking about, there's all these mandolin players who might live within 20 miles of each other but not know each other. Mm-hmm. And it's a place to sort of hang out and connect people. And there's something, much as the real world is like really important for connecting, to be able to do what I do, I have to rely on online stuff and, and there's something really powerful about that. It's about, and I think it's the same thing that you've done with Mandolins and Beer that you're talking about with Scott. You just build a community of people who are interested in the thing, and people really invest in that because particularly if the thing that they like is seen by the rest of the world as fairly niche.
Oh yeah.
Like just to be able to hang out with people who want to know those geeky little details and talk about picks for half an hour and, all of that stuff is really interesting.
For sure. And probably much like you too, it's like, it's cool. It is so nichey. You know what I mean? Like, a mandolin podcast, I'm surprised. I'm honestly surprised how many people listen to it. Like, it blows my mind to think that there's that many mandolin players out there and that this little niche thing, but it's, like it's been like a few times, like on like the Chartable accounts, like when I've interviewed like bigger players, like it's been like number 8 in the interviews for iTunes for music interviews, and how podcast charts work there. It's all fluid. So that can change 2 hours later, to get something like that. But then I'll go like talk to my mom or my doctor. Like my doctor has it. It's so funny. My doctor has it in my chart apparently. And I only found this because I had to go to the emergency room And when I got in there, they're like, "Oh, you have a podcast?" And I'm like, "Oh, you don't have a podcast? Like, what's in your chart?" But then they ask, "Oh, who's on the podcast?" And to me, like saying Sam Bush, David Grisman, and Tim O'Brien, you know what I mean? Like those are like, you know, heroes of mine. Like to me, that is like the biggest people I could ever even imagine to talk to. But like to everyday people, they have like, they just kind of look at you like, huh? Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
I mean, imagine I have the same thing over in the UK. You know, I'll interview like Sierra Hull or Bryan Sutton or Chris Eldridge, and like proudly go and tell people, and they go, "No, don't know who that is."
Yeah.
I think the only person I've ever interviewed that anybody I know has heard of is Alison Krauss.
You know, I
It's,
love
you know,
I love to tell the story in a similar thing. I had Dan Tominski on, and he's the voice of George Clooney, and that was like the first time my mom was like, "Oh wow, your podcast must be pretty popular to have the voice of George Clooney on." It's so. Meanwhile, it's, you know, maybe one of the best vocalists, multi-instrumentalists, and instrumentalists in bluegrass music ever. You know, GC's so incredible on his own right, but the only way like people who don't listen to bluegrass would know him would be like he was the "Oh Brother." He's the guy who's sang "Oh Brother Where Art Thou," or the "Man of Constant Sorrow" in the movie. So
yeah,
so funny.
yeah, it's funny, isn't it? But I think, like you were saying, you know, you're not a trade interviewer and all of that stuff. But I think that's the power of. I think the power of your interviews is that you are asking the kind of questions that the average mandolin player sat at home wants to know the answers to, because you're so clearly a huge fan of the players and the talking about mandolins and all of that stuff, that it's really kind of direct and relatable. Like you're asking the things they would want to ask if they were there, and you clearly sound excited to be having the conversations. And I think that's really really clear.
Oh, thank you. I mean, you know, and a lot of that stems from like, I just want to get better every day too. And everybody who plays, no matter who it is or what level they're at, or like what style of bluegrass or genre, I mean, it might be jazz, but they all have something they're doing that I am not doing for sure. It could be any weird little thing. Like I'm gonna try it out in the hopes that I think every time I hang up from one of these interviews or get done editing a podcast interview, like I pick up my mandolin and I feel like I become a little bit better of a player each time after I talk to these people. Because it's just, and it's inspiring to talk to these people who love the same thing I love as much as I love it. You know, I self-professed mandolin nerd. You know, I proudly say it. I love everything about it, you know, from strings to picks to the wood that's on the mandolins. Like all that stuff is mind blowing, and there's just so much information people have. So I love to pick their brains about it.
And when these people get together, like, you know, they talk to each other about this stuff too, like endlessly. And
Yeah.
it's a bit like you were saying at the beginning, you know, when to see a couple of people playing at a picnic table at a festival. Like, so it was one of the things about this music is that some of the most golden moments of bluegrass and string band music happen socially, away from a microphone, away from a concert stage. It's just like this stuff. And that's one of the joys of Instagram and stuff, is that you get to see moments of this. Like you might hear a couple of people picking a fiddle tune who wouldn't record that for their record. But it's still the same with your podcast interviews as well. It's like, it's that hanging out, having a chat, and letting other people listen to it. It's the same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And that is definitely one of the things I had to learn. You know, when I first started the podcast, again, like I was just recording a phone call essentially. And what happens in a phone call is you talk about something, and then they talk about something, and then they might ask you a question, and then you respond to it with your experience. But when I first started, nobody knew who I was. So people are only tuning in to hear what, you know, Mike Marshall had to say, or David Benedict, or whoever. And I didn't, you know, I just was like, I guess I didn't really even think about that, you know. So I really edited, like I would have conversations sometimes that were 2 hours long, and I could whittle it down to a 1 hour podcast, because they're just as interested in talking with me as I am talking with them, but maybe not the listener is interested in those things. So I really do edit. I mean, I edit as much of me out as possible now, and just try to make it really concise and about that person. And, you know, like this week, I guess, this Friday when the album comes out, I'm my guest on my own podcast, and David Benedict, who was my first guest ever, did the interview. And, you know, Because like over the course of time now, people have been like, when are you going to be the guest? When are you going to be the guest? And I just never felt like I should be the guest. But now that I have an album coming out and I feel like I've created a reason to be a guest on like your podcast, it's awesome to be on this. It's a huge honor to be on this podcast that Allison Krauss was on, and a bunch of my heroes, the same as your heroes. But what I also love about you and your podcast too is I also know we seem similar in a sense of like, I remember when you posted a picture of that 33 and a third book series for Duran Duran's Rio. I love that album. Like I didn't grow up listening to bluegrass. I mean, I was an MTV kid, and so like I love Duran Duran and I love all sorts of different styles of music, And so I remember seeing that, and it just was like another connection that I felt like I had with you besides hearing you on the podcast, and before we had met. And I just think that's so cool that you have, same as me, we have influences outside of this too, but we just happen to love this one thing.
Well, and that's what I love about this record is we'll talk about this at the top, about this idea of interviewing a load of people, and like you could have ended up with an album with 11 versions of Big Mun on it or whatever, or 11 versions of Rawhide, and like fine, but like that's not interesting really compared to like, here's what these people represent to me, here's some stuff that they find cool that is beyond all of that. And I think you're right, that stuff really deepens your sense of connection to people, because like nobody has one musical influence.
No, and if we did, it would be we would sound just like generic versions of whoever it is we're trying to sound like. I mean, there are some guys that can play the Monroe style so good. I mean, I don't want to leave anybody out, obviously, but like Mike Compton, Lauren Price Napier, so good. But like even they sound like themselves. They sound like a version of the Monroe style. And they're both incredible mandolin style players, you know what I mean? And so, it's just eventually it's going to sound a little bit different. But if everybody just did that, it would be tough to be better than what Mike Compton and Lauren Price Napier do. You know what I mean? Like they are incredible players, but they also have different influences, so.
Yeah, and like you don't have to listen to Sierra Hull for very long to hear some Chris Thile coming through.
Right.
Like just the way she uses slides and the way she phrases some things, you can clearly hear she grew up, idolizing Chris Thile. But there's so much more to. She's one of the most extraordinary, rounded, diverse, fascinating instrumentalists and singers like out there. And yet you can hear this thread at the same time that's almost always there, and that's the joy of it all, isn't it?
Yeah, I think maybe currently in the past couple of years, I don't think I have been. Andrew Marlin would definitely be a close second in this, but like, but they're also completely different players. But like, Sierra Hall, if an Instagram video is coming up and it's Sierra Hall playing, I'm not doing anything until that video is over, because I just can't wrap my head around how good she continues to get. Like, just when you think her tone is incredible, you hear something else and she's somehow even better sounding than this incredible tone she has, and that's inspiring to me, because again, that's what I love about this instrument and like the people that play it and that I interview is everybody's still trying to get better. Like Sam Bush still feels like there's things he needs and wants to work on. That's why Sam Bush is what he is, and that's what really, it's like an endless pursuit, which is exactly, what fun is it? I guess there's some accomplishment. I mean, I guess like to playing, I'm not a video gamer, but I guess I would imagine if, spending 2 years playing a video game and beating it, there's probably a rewarding thing to that. But to me, the rewarding thing is there is really no end game at trying to get better. I mean, if that's what you're looking to do.
Well, being out at IBMA a couple of weeks ago and seeing Jerry Douglas being inducted into the Bluegrass Hall of Fame, and him basically in his speech saying, I'm still looking for that tone and one day maybe I'll find it. Yeah. And, like, is there a better instrumental tone in the world than Jerry Douglas's? Probably not. But at the same time, he's never quite satisfied with it. Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And that's why Jerry Douglas is Jerry Douglas, and, but that's why I think everybody is who they are, who have come up through this and have kind of made a name for themselves. I mean, I really can't think of anybody who's like that I've listened to or that I've had on the podcast that is like rested on their laurels in any of this. I mean, they've committed to wanting to do this, and it is super hard to do. You know what I mean? Like bluegrass music, there aren't, people try. I mean, Thiele, right? Like if you're thinking of the one person who maybe everybody might really know now, like Thiele's definitely ascended that circle of being a mandolin player. That's the one person I can say their name or say I play mandolin, and most people be like, "Oh, have you heard Chris Thiele?" But like, I don't think he's driving around like a Lamborghini. You know what I mean? Like this, this isn't the genre to get into because you want to be rich. It seems to me like this is a genre you get into because you love the music.
And you spend the money on a lure rather than a Lamborghini, right?
Right. Now you might have a couple lures, but But you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm pretty sure he never got into this thinking he was going to own a Lloyd Loar mandolin when he was a little kid doing this, or even like Jarrod Walker from Billy Strings. When I interviewed him and I got to hang out with him at the hotel, they did 2 shows in Charleston at a hockey arena. Completely both shows sold out. Jarrod Walker grew up listening to, like the Bluegrass Album Band, and this wasn't on the radar for him. He didn't get into this because he thought he was going to play the Ohio football stadium opening for somebody in front of 80,000 people. He got into it because he loved this music that's as niche-y as you can get, Well, not as you can get, but it's pretty niche-y, if you're a kid playing mandolin in high school.
Yeah, and just that thing you're talking about then about, people looking for their sound and that being the journey. Like just glancing down the list of players on this record, like you look at Sam Bush and Tim O'Brien and Jarrod Walker and Ronnie McCoury and Matt Flinner and Harry Clark and these are Jacob Jolliff, they all have their thing, and they were all still, very different stages of their journeys, some of them, but they're all on the same journey, looking for that tone, looking for that sound, trying to get what's in their head out through their fingers and their instrument,
Yeah, and finding happiness in that as well, like it is a lot of hard work. I buddies with Jake Jolliff, and that guy's out there. He pays some great musicians to go on the road with him that I don't know what it is, but he like that, he arranges all that himself. He books dates, he does the travel, books the travel, he does it all, and it's because he loves what he does. It's just the passion that somebody has, and if you can find happiness in your passion, to me it's so rewarding. To say that I make a living playing mandolin still sounds ridiculous to say out loud, but I've also set my expectations since I was a kid. Like I never had to live in a mansion. I just want to pay my bills and play music. You know what I mean? I want to have reliable transportation, a house. I want to be able to support my family, and I want to be happy. It doesn't seem like that's an impossible thing to do. It's once you set an expectation, and yeah, I play a lot of gigs, but they aren't, they're menu venues a lot of times, we like to call them. They're, playing brunches and stuff like that, but I'm playing music, and I'm playing music I love, you know what I mean? Like we can get as weird as we want at any of these gigs and play anything we want at these gigs, which is really, really awesome. And that's really how I was able to develop some of these songs that I do too, because I, play with guys who I'm like, hey, let's try Drive by the Cars. I learned this, and they're good enough to musicians where we learn it while I'm playing it at the gig for the first time, and then refine it and work on little things here and there. So, I'm so thankful, dude. And so grateful that, I also should, give a huge shout out to my wife, who's like the biggest supporter, when I was, I worked for Barnes and Noble, the big book company, for 17 years, I guess, as like a general manager, which is a pretty steady job that I probably could still be working today and, eventually retired from. And I was miserable, it's just, I wasn't happy, and my wife could see I wasn't happy. And so we made a plan, and I started like a home inspection company to quit so I would have some sort of income because, I was like, oh, I'm fortunate to live in Charleston where music is just like live music is like at every venue. You know what I mean? Like they aren't the most rewarding gigs, but if you want to make $75 somewhere, there's a place you can do it if you're willing to do it. And I was like, I'll play any gig I can. And so I left Barnes & Noble, started this home inspection thing. But the minute I could play more gigs, that's the other thing is like people knew I could play and wanted to hire me. But I worked a retail job 50 hours a week, and that includes weekends. And the weekends I had off, I wanted to spend time also with my family and not just go play in a bar till 1 a.m. So the calls stop coming when you have to say no a bunch of times. But when you can say yes all the time, the phone rings until until your calendar's full if you want. And we went to Ireland in 2019 for a month with my wife's work. And we were flying back and I said, I have one home inspection on the books for July. And after that, I'm just going to play music. Is that cool? And she's like, 100%. Because at that point, my calendar was like, I was booked till December 31st with gigs. I mean, I was playing 12 gigs a week sometimes, 3-hour gigs. So it was a grind, but I loved every second of it. Yeah, I'm glad I don't have to do that many gigs now. You get to the point where you can raise your fee and play better places and stuff like that. But, nothing's going to get you better than playing in 3 gigs a day sometimes, 9 hours of gigs. Get done, head over to the next place, and do it. So, yeah, I just feel lucky.
Well, it's really exciting to see where it's kind of taken you. Like you say, you never know where you're going to end up when you start out on these journeys. And best of luck with this record because it's a really cool project. And by the time people hear this, it'll be out in the world. Hope it does really well for you.
Thank you so much, Matt. And thank you for what you do. And I'm really so happy for you that you're getting the podcast. Like podcasts are a niche too, compared to, like when you go to IBMA and like somebody asks you what a podcast is, there's still a portion of those. The older grassers have no idea what a podcast is. And so it really is remarkable to see a podcaster get nominated for Broadcaster of the Year. I was so happy for you. And it's such a huge leap for all us podcasters out there, man. So the fact that you do what you do and that you're having me on and you're helping spread the word I really appreciate that and have the utmost respect for what you do, man.
Oh, thanks, mate. Right back at you. Same goes. I think it's, these people who don't know about podcasts, they're missing some great stuff, right?
And even if you don't like music, you know what I mean? Like there's a podcast for everything out there, it's just, there's some really cool stuff out there and they're so informational, and just, if you've never listened to, I guess it'd be weird to say that if we're on a podcast, if you've never listened to a podcast, but if this is, this is what you do, look into some other types of things too. I mean, there's like great music podcasts. My wife listens to all these financial podcasts all the time. She loves them. I mean, there's something out there for everybody. So yeah. And having a podcast has changed my life, which is, it's just crazy. I literally had somebody, I was playing a gig this Sunday and I saw like a local musician there and they're like, I saw your, us local, we don't see each other very often because we're always working so much. And he's like, man, I just saw your album's coming out. He's like, like 5 years ago, would you have thought this was possible? I'm like, 1 year ago, I probably wouldn't have thought, or it was possible. You know what I mean? Like, it's just really opened doors up and yeah, it's crazy to me. And it's awesome to be on your podcast. It's because I've listened to so many of your episodes and to be on a podcast with that so many people who I respect and love and look up to have been on is just, it's astounding to me. Like I still am having a hard time wrapping my head around looking at you on the screen. I'm going to be on one of your episodes. So
it's been really cool. I'm delighted that you're here. It's I've been looking forward to this one.
And we have to do the opposite. We have to have you on my podcast because I would love to have you on because you've definitely gleaned some information I think that people will be able to get. That's my thing too. I got asked recently, do I only have mandolin players on there? I'm like, it's a majority mandolin players. Well, like I had Rebecca Fraser on this past week. You've had her on as a guest too, but
Mhm.
she's an incredible player, and she had great advice coming from a different angle that still worked for mandolin players. Like, as long as somebody's going to get something mandolin that they can apply to mandolin out of an episode, I'm going to have them on. Let's have you on sometime to talk about just some of the guests you've had and the experience that you had, over there in London and England, and how bluegrass is over there. So
Anytime. Any excuse to talk to you is a good excuse.
awesome. Same here, buddy. Well, thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you. It's been fun. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.